Hans, you and I have always thought that the actual start of the virus was much earlier than has been formally acknowledged. The narrative that's out there is that it happened maybe sometime in November, sometime in December when it began and began its spread throughout Wuhan. And again, we've always argued that it happened earlier than that for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. But now it seems like there's some new data points that is helping to push that timeline back. And it's important for a couple of reasons. There's been some surrounding events that you and I have always looked at and been, frankly, kind of alarmed about, but they didn't perfectly fit with this later start of the COVID virus, this potential lab leak. So as it turns out, identifying the actual time frame in which the virus likely leaked from the lab is fairly important because it suddenly adds new relevance to a variety of meetings that happened in seemingly pretty short order. So, I think we feel a little bit more comfortable of actually saying that this thing started, I don't know, maybe in August, certainly no later than early September, and maybe even earlier than that. So with that, why don't we go ahead and kick things off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been quite a few developments on various fronts of the sort of the COVID origin debate, and as always, they always point in the same direction. But you're right; these one, like the one study, for instance, is very indicative of it having started earlier. Now, we'll go through a few of these things here. I mean, let's start with there's one new study which disproved the market theory. So the market theory is that it started in the market in like mid-December, which it just never fit with the evidence. But nonetheless, that was the study that was being pushed. All of Fauci's natural origin hoaxers, they're all on that paper. This is from a few years ago, and then they had an additional paper, and of course, New York Times, and everyone just jumped on that. Yeah, it came out of the market. It's obvious. It's solved. It's dispositive. That was the word they used. And of course, you knew and I knew that was absolutely not true. It just didn't fit. But nonetheless, that was the narrative. So now you have a guy in China who disproved it. Now, we can talk about the dynamics here in a moment, like why would he be allowed to and all that. But let's maybe first talk about what his study is and who this guy is. So he's the guy who sequenced COVID very early on in early January of 20, or even late December of 2019, early January of 2020. And he had this lab in Shanghai that sequenced COVID, and he wanted to release it, to the world. And his punishment for doing that was he had his lab shut down by the Chinese government. So now, a few years later, this guy has a study where he looks at all these early sequences. So he obtained sequences from early COVID patients. And the sequences are basically like the 30,000 base pairs of the virus. So the virus is basically, it's like the instruction manual for the virus. The DNA or RNA in viruses, the ATGC, the stuff we learned back in school. So there's 30,000 pairs of those, and that's the virus. That's how the virus is built. So over time, some of those A's flip into T's and C's to G's and whatever. Those are mutations. Now, the market theory said that in the market, there were two different viruses. So the 30,000 base pairs were different in two ways. The problem with that is that if you're different in two ways, there's a middle step, there's an intermediary. Let's say an A changed to a T and a C changed into a G. Well, that didn't happen simultaneously. So one happened first and then the other happened later. So the question is, where's the intermediary virus? When did the middle one happen? And of course, the market people didn't have one. And so they said, no, these were two separate COVID viruses, so two separate outbreaks at the same market. By the way, that was one of the reasons why this was always so completely laughable. Anyway, to make a long story short, this Chinese guy from Shanghai, he published this new study where he found these intermediary viruses where like only one C had changed to a G and the A had not changed into a T, or whatever. I'm just don't quote me on the A's and C's and G's, just to get the point across. So he found the middle ones. So that immediately disproved the market theory, because that means it started at one change, one C became a G, and then over time another something became another something, and then a third, and then a fourth, and so on. So the market theory was dead at that point. But But the other thing that comes out of that study is that the virus must have started earlier in order for these changes to have happened over time. So now, based on that study, I mean, people have been placing it kind of more in the September region, which is what you and I have thought for a long time. But there's also evidence that it might have been even earlier than that.
Yeah, once we have that, and once we understand, okay, here's proof that although it's not a defining date, it's proof that things started earlier. We went back and start looking at other events that were surrounding this. Now, when you and I were doing our work on our first timeline and on the infographic, et cetera, one of the things that we came across was this strange piece that was written up in State Department magazine, which frankly I didn't know there was a State Department magazine. And it was quoting the U.S. Consul General at the time in Wuhan, a guy named Russell Westergaard. And it was very interesting because he was relaying his experiences on the ground in Wuhan at the time of the outbreak. And one of the things that he was noting is that in early October, there was a huge surge in sickness. And although they didn't know it at the time, it seems to be the onset of COVID. And what they defined it as was the appearance of an unusually vicious flu season, is how he defined it. And that ultimately led him to send these cables back to the U.S., warning them of what was going on. So that alone, it appears pretty certain that the virus was already propagating throughout the city of Wuhan by early October. Now, we've got a couple other data points as well. One of them is a study by, I think it was Harvard, where they were looking at the hospital activity. So they were looking at things a little bit differently. They were looking at activity in terms of kind of a population buzz around the hospitals and what was going on there. And they ended up looking at 5 different hospitals and said that the activity picked up materially, as well as internet searches for symptoms that ended up matching COVID-like symptoms. And this happened in September and early October. So now we've got another data point, which is pushing this thing back further and further. And that study's out there and people can find it, I think, pretty easily. And so then this brings us back to another event which we've talked about forever and ever, and that's the sudden removal of the virus database, the Wuhan Laboratories virus database, which was supposed to be in public existence through EcoHealth's Peter Daszak, his agreement with NIH. One of the tenets of that agreement was that the virus database, of which he was a part, was supposed to be maintained online. And on September 12th, 2019, that database was suddenly taken offline, and we've never gotten a good explanation for it. Nor has that database ever been made public, and nor has anybody looked at it, as we can get into in a little bit, including the WHO, who had an investigative team out there, and for whatever unknown reason, decided to accept Peter Daszak's word that, it's not important and they don't actually need to look at that, despite that database probably being one of the singular most data points that we could find in terms of determining what they were actually working on.
Right. It's incredibly important. And it's one of those data points that sort of had been raised early on and then kind of got lost in all the noise, I guess. But now with, first of all, with this new study that showed that there were at least 3 mutations in order, that would have taken a while to progress, and that taking the timeline back, I guess, has brought the database removal kind of back into focus, which I think is fantastic because, let's look at it from the perspective of these Chinese researchers. And anyone who's been to China, anyone who's been to these institutes, universities, and so on, and when there's a project like that, and you put out your database, there's a lot of pride attached. So to take that down is a huge loss of face. That's like not good. This is like, we're the super duper researchers and we have all this stuff here. So this is not just something you do, especially when you consider loss of face. So why did they do it? Now, Daszak's explanation is that, there was a hacking attempt. What hacking attempt? It's a database. You can just go and get the virus data. Of course, that never made any sense. But I think the bigger point here is the timing and the fact that this is not something you would happily do if you are the person who assembled all that data, and you have pride in that. We're not only talking about sort of nefarious actors, we're talking about kind of just run-of-the-mill researchers in the lab, and just people who do these experiments, and they they take pride in what they do. So anyway, the database was taken down, and as you say, we've never seen it again. Now, September 12th, that to us was always sort of the main data point, I suppose, in terms of when this thing must have started. Now, in my view, that doesn't mean that the Wuhan lab knew on September 12th that COVID had leaked out of its lab. What it means is that they knew it could have leaked out of its lab. They had some indication. Someone had left the door open. Someone, I'm just oversimplifying here, but something happened where they were like, "Oops," and then they just, as a precautionary thing, just took this thing down, and they would have probably put it back up a month or two later or whatever if nothing had happened. But of course, something did happen.
Well, that's always the big counter argument. Like let's say that you accept that there was a hacking attempt. Like, okay, maybe. Why did it stay down if the kind of media narrative, if the government narrative, all of that is that COVID came out in December? That's plenty of time to have the database back up and running in those intervening dates, and that didn't happen. That just doesn't pass the smell test. There's something else that caused them to take that down and to never bring it back up.
That's right. And this also ties in with the argument that was made by Fauci's natural origin gang and the proximal fraud people, the people who wrote that proximal fraud paper, where they say, oh, because no known backbone was used in COVID, there's not no known backbone there, therefore it must be natural. Obviously, you don't know what the known backbones are because, first of all, you don't know what the Wuhan lab had. And second of all, they took down their database.
Yeah. So there's another interesting data point that we came across, and that's a guy named, I'm going to butcher his name here, Zhao Yushin. Yeah. And, this was a Chinese researcher who was, of all things, working on a COVID vaccine in October 2019. We know this because Bob Kadlec of the NIH was talking about this. And Kadlec had a kind of, to me, a little bit of a twisted hypothesis. But what he said is that he thought perhaps, let me back up for a moment. We know that there was 3 researchers that came down, at least there was multiple reporting of 3 researchers who became ill in November 2019-ish. A lot of people point to that. Oh, that must have possibly been the start of things. And Kadlec sort of does the same. But what he says is he thinks it may have come out of the vaccine research and that it was through that mechanism that these people got sick. Now, first of all, Kadlec's probably got his own reasons for wanting the timeline to be out when it is, to be out in November. But to me, what's interesting is the very fact that you have this guy that was working on a COVID vaccine in October. Why would he be doing that? I think
why would he fall off a building soon after?
Well, that's another great point that we hadn't. Yeah, just so everybody knows, he actually filed a patent for his vaccine in February of 2020, and somehow must have been going for a cigarette, in the afternoon and on the top of the building at the Wuhan lab in May of 2020, and apparently wasn't watching where he was walking and fell and plummeted to his death. Amazing how that happens. So just him. So this guy was working on a vaccine in October of 2019. Now, when I look at this and look at the events, some of which we've already covered, that place the timeline further back, most importantly, the study you referenced, I think what happened is that they knew that a lab leak had either happened or may have happened. And they took the database down and they subsequently began working in a hurry on trying to find a vaccine for COVID-19. And it's entirely possible that those 3 researchers either got sick like other people in Wuhan were getting sick through the general population, or were exposed to the work that was actually going on in trying to find the COVID vaccine. So I see it as a little bit backwards from the way that Kadlec describes it and think that that's a much more likely scenario for what happens. And I think it explains a lot better as to why this guy was working on a vaccine in the first place.
Right, and that ties in with Stéphane Bancel, the CEO of Moderna,
Yes, it does.
who said that he knew in 2019 that there was going to be a pandemic, and that he ordered his people over there at Moderna to mobilize for a massive increase in making vaccines. And by massive, I think they were at 100. Moderna, by the way, was not like, they weren't like Pfizer. They were not like a big company that was making lots of drugs.
Right.
That company was made through or made big by COVID, or these so-called vaccines. So they were, I think they were doing about 100,000 vials a year, something in that order. And then he upped it to 1 billion, from 100,000 to 1 billion, just on a hunch. I mean, that sort of sounds a bit odd, right? And then, of course, him and Fauci made this agreement in early January to mobilize to make the vaccine, to get it into the population.
And this vaccine that we're talking about is the mRNA vaccine.
Right. And again, early January, Fauci was telling us there's nothing to worry about. Why is he telling Moderna to mobilize to get everyone vaccinated with this stuff? There's always, just to be clear, I don't think necessarily that this Moderna guy got a call from the Wuhan lab telling him like, hey, you better, I don't think it's a sort of conspiracy at that level. And by the way, Fauci too. But I think it's perfectly feasible or possible that there was some gossip that something like that might have happened, or to be on the lookout for something like that, something more along those lines. And as for Fauci, I mean, first of all, same reasoning. And second of all, a burning desire for decades. If you go back to his speeches and his testimony in Congress, I mean, the guy was around for 40 years as head of NIAID. And throughout those 40 years, he was pushing this stuff like crazy. It was like he needed that to happen. The universal vaccine, the mRNA, was his thing. And of course, mRNA had been around since the 70s, but there was no delivery method, just technically not possible, because it's so brittle, it just falls apart. So you had to find a vehicle to get it into human cells, and that was not possible until 2018. But technically that became possible. And then it was as if Fauci was just burning to get it out there, like, oh, it's 2018, now we can do it. Let's do it. Oh, we don't have a reason to do it. Let's find a reason to do it.
Well, it was, in my mind, it's even more than that, because the 2018 timeframe, you're talking about the lipid particle, which surrounded a little fatty bubble, which kept the virus alive. And that was developed in response to the Ebola outbreak that was raging at the time. And I mean, that's a whole nother story, which we've covered before. But in my mind, I think that Ebola outbreak almost certainly came out of the Kanema lab, which just so happened to be run by Christian Anderson and Robert Gary, two of the authors of Proximal Origin. So these same characters keep tying back in again. But they had developed this new mRNA vaccine, and it was proving reasonably effective, but they had a problem. Is the market for where the Ebola was breaking out was both non-lucrative, and it was a very small market. And so, they had this drug, but they had this new method, I guess maybe is a better way to say it than a drug. They had this new technology to produce these mRNA vaccines, but they had no large market for it. And it seemed that they were longing for finding, a much larger provable market. And they weren't going to find it in the Western Hemisphere because there was no trials done. There was none of that. It was going to, I don't know. We probably each have our own thoughts on how long, but, I think we're talking about certainly years, but more likely decades before the mRNA vaccine would be accepted in the Western world, maybe if ever. And it took a precipitating event for them to open up this new market, and that precipitating event was COVID.
Right, because the problem, and this was also recognized once the delivery method had been devised in 2018. The problem was that, first of all, you had no long-term testing of any kind, and second of all, you want to get this stuff into the flesh and not into the bloodstream, but how do you ensure that doesn't happen? And what happens if it does? And, there's just so many unknowns at that point. And, we know from the past that these things, every vaccine has taken years and years of not only development, but then, testing and trials and so on. And none of that happened here. And as you say, on purpose. That was the whole point. Just get it out there. Fauci's, when you talk about Ebola, one of the problems of Ebola, well, it's not a problem, it's a good thing, but to people like Fauci, is that it's not very infectious. It's not like you just go to, go out and like with COVID and then you got it. That makes the market much smaller, as you mentioned. And Fauci, just to get into his mindset, right? When you said that, it reminded me of an old clip of his from the 80s where he's just fear mongering about AIDS. And he's saying, oh, yeah, if you got an AIDS person in your home, you might get it. And you're just kind of totally fear mongering about it. It's like he had this drive of everyone's going to get it. And therefore, we need to get everyone vaccinated with universal vaccines and mRNA and so on. That was like, it's like this thing that drove him. And then, he was like 80 years old, and suddenly it happened that he had this opportunity.
Yeah, well, part of that brings me then back to, we had talked about some other events that transpired, and as we move the time frame back as to when there was likely a lab leak, suddenly these events become a little bit more interesting. And you just sort of kind of inadvertently touched on one of them, and it was a paper that was done by Johns Hopkins. And it was done at the request of a global preparedness board. And there's 15 members on this board, one of which is Anthony Fauci of NIH, Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust, the guy that organized Fauci's secret teleconference, Gao Fu, who's the head of the China CDC, and Chris Elias, who is he's the kind of the lead doctor running the Gates Foundation's programs. All four of these members were on this board, and they commissioned this study that was done by Johns Hopkins, who, by the way, Johns Hopkins keeps popping up again and again and again throughout all of this. And the study was released on September 10th, 2 days before the Wuhan lab shut down their database. A week later, the Global Preparedness Board issued this report that was effectively a preparation for a global pandemic. And the description they used was effectively a perfect description of COVID. Before we'd looked at this thing and we'd had our concerns about it or kind of questions about it, but it didn't necessarily fit into the timeline. Well, if we have this new timeline, the title of their study was Preparedness for a High-Impact Respiratory Pathogen Pandemic. And one of the things that they noted in there that I don't think we'd ever seen before was a push for the use of mRNA vaccines, and saying that mRNA vaccines were going to be the responsive element for this, and that a lot of money should be funneled into, and there should be a lot of preparation for the use of mRNA vaccines if an event such as this was to transpire. So, we still don't have a firm enough time frame to sort of prove anything, but suddenly this event, which had always really kind of bothered, I think, the both of us, I certainly know I was always troubled by the timing of it, suddenly it gets to have a little bit more relevance as the further we move the outbreak, the leak from a lab back, the more relevance this has. There's a couple other events which we can jump to in a minute, but I'll let you get in here.
Well, I think this kind of takes us back to the DEFUSE proposal and how it is that the Wuhan lab started, like Zhao Yuzhen. Why was Zhao Yuzhen trying to do a vaccine anyway? And why were they trying to make COVID in a lab and all that? So I think a lot of this traces back to the DEFUSE proposal and paranoia. And from that, we can kind of extrapolate other things. Like once that got set in motion, a bunch of other things like Event 201 might have not been a direct consequence of that, but certainly kind of been informed on that basis of what was going on. And what was going on was that in 2018, Daszak and his crew had this proposal to make COVID in a lab. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but only a very, very little bit, because a COVID-like virus in a lab. Then I'm not oversimplifying at that point. That's literally what DEFUSE is. But I think what's really missed with the DEFUSE proposal is what Daszak's rationale was and where he wanted to get it funded. So he wanted to get something like $14 million from the Pentagon to pay for this. And his rationale was that he needed this to protect American soldiers from coronaviruses. And you're like, what? Why would that be like? the last time there was an outbreak, 774 people died worldwide. No Americans at all, by the way, no one in the United States. And it was just like, why would you, what's going on here? Now, probably it was just Daszak doing Daszak stuff, being a grifter. But look at it from the Chinese perspective. So Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan lab, she was on that proposal as well. I mean, she was one of the authors. So she had access to every last detail of that. She had access to all the drafts, to all the discussions, to all the technical details, to all the know-how, everything.
With all of the technical details coming from Ralph Barrick at UNC, who was also on that proposal.
Exactly. Exactly. But then, and this is the key point here, Pentagon said, no, this is too dangerous. What does Shi Zhengli do at that point? We're talking 2018. Does she just go, oh, well, forget about it? Or does she tell someone back home about this? Hey, the Americans wanted to make this vaccine to protect their soldiers from a coronavirus. And by the way, Ralph Barrick is making these viruses in his lab. And by the way, there's Fort Detrick and there's all kinds of other people involved, Franz and all these other people on the Daszak side. So what are we going to do with this? And then the paranoia kicks in. I mean, there's curiosity, but there's also just paranoia, because then you're thinking, well, the Americans just said they're not going to fund it because you're on it. And by the way, one of Daszak's proposals said, let's try and take the Chinese people out here kind of from a perception basis, like just take their names out or downplay their roles until we get the money, and then we'll bring them back in. Again, that feeds paranoia. So what does Shi Zhengli think? And my view is she probably thinks, well, we need to do this because the Americans are going to do it behind our backs. Number one. Number two, and I think this is where it gets really, really interesting. We found out this week something about Shi Zhengli that we kind of suspected but didn't know about.
Well, actually, before we jump into that, it's also worth noting that money wasn't the issue here. Just because they didn't get the 14 million from DARPA, in no way does that stop the Chinese lab from doing anything. And it might not even have been paranoia. It may well have just been sort of capitalist opportunism. Oh my God, we've got a complete gift of all this technical data. And it's worth noting that this proposal was so technically complete that it looks like some of the work actually had already taken place. So, it's literally a blueprint for the virus that now the Chinese have in their possession. And yeah, I think it's almost silly to think that they wouldn't do it. But where I believe you were going was some of the work that you've been doing on the firing of a couple Chinese scientists from a Canadian lab, which had always struck us as a little odd. But as we began to do, you really did most of the digging on this part of it, but as we looked into that, we suddenly find out, wait a minute, once again, there's an overlay of all of the same participants. And this came from a photo that included the Canadian scientists. Why don't you just jump in and take this part away?
Sure. Just to kind of take it from where you said that they would have just done it out of curiosity, or they get this super duper
opportunism
Western proposal blueprint, all the technology, let's do it, let's jump in. I think up until this week I was more or less in that camp, and I still am. I'm sure that's part of the motivation. But as you say, what we found out from this Canadian lab scandal has changed that perspective a bit, because just to retell it very quickly, there was these two Chinese spies. Well, one of them was confirmed, and her husband, who worked at the Winnipeg National Lab, which is the Canadian government's premier lab. This is not just some random lab.
Flagship.
And so she was caught shipping man-made viruses, Ebola, Nipah, off to China, but not just off to China, to the Wuhan lab. What? And this was in 2019, so before COVID. And someone, I think someone was caught with a vial, and it just sort of things started to unravel
is probably the right word.
Yeah, and then they were, the two of them were suspended, or at least had their clearance taken away, but they were not fired yet. And then the Canadian intelligence services started an investigation into this whole thing. And so what happened is that now we have that report. By the way, the report is not really one report. It's more of a bundle of reports. It's like 620 or 630 odd pages or so. A lot of it is redacted, but sort of right in the middle of that stack, there's a very interesting kind of sub-report, and it relates to this woman, Chu, who was chucked out of the Winnipeg lab, and Shi Zhengli. But Shi Zhengli is not named. Shi Zhengli in the Canadian report is referred to as individual one. But once you extrapolate some of the information, individual one was involved with that, and then involved with that, and then you put it together, and then
it wasn't terribly hard to be certain that individual one is Shi Zhengli.
No, this was not super hard. So, but here's the thing, and here's how it ties back into DEFUSE and what we were talking about earlier. So, Shi Zhengli was basically this woman's handler at the Wuhan lab, and Shi Zhengli was also this woman. By this woman, I mean Chu. Chu is the lady at the Winnipeg lab who was stealing these viruses and shipping them to China. She was also the intermediary between Chu and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And then it turns out that Chu was a member of the 1,000 Talent Program, and that's the Chinese program, the Chinese spying program, the Chinese government spying program, where they recruit people in advanced Western labs and universities, people who have highly advanced knowledge on atomic energy, lasers, avionics, all that kind of stuff, plus biotech. And she was a recruit, and apparently by she I mean Chu. I know this kind of gets confusing sometimes. So I'll just say Shi Zhengli when I mean Shi Zhengli, and I'll say Chu when I mean Chu. So this lady Chu at the Winnipeg lab, she was the only recruit they had in a high biosafety level 4 Western lab with access to, like what we mentioned earlier, Ebola, everything, man-made Ebola, not just Ebola.
Highest security labs that exist.
So Chu was a huge asset to this 1,000 Talents program. So she funneled her knowledge to the Wuhan lab, and then the Wuhan lab funneled it to the PLA. And so what we found out in a nutshell is that Shi Zhengli was kind of the middle person in all of this. Now, up to now, Shi Zhengli was just a bat woman. She was just this lady who was like interested in bats and did these bat viruses. Now we've opened the door to something, far more nefarious.
It's hilarious in many. Well, it's not hilarious, but she's always portrayed as kind of this jungle traipsing bat woman, and it was the bat woman of China. And suddenly we have her reframed, which makes a lot of sense because the Wuhan, the laboratory at the WIB, their BSL-4, which was a new lab, was the state of the art in all of China. It was the best thing that they had. And we know that we had, China CDC or the China CDC officials at the lab. We had people from the CCP at the lab. It makes suddenly it all makes a ton of sense that you have, if you think of Shi Zhengli not as a Batwoman, but rather as a rather highly placed asset who was involved in getting, biotech, both technology and viruses, as we know, transferred over to the premier lab in China. It places everything in an entirely different perspective and gives an entirely new look on her. But, we still, I think it's worth going back to this sequence of events. We know this was transpiring. We know what Shi Zhengli was doing. We know that the virus happened earlier than we thought, although we still don't have a definitive date for that. But we have these sequence of events which seem to follow the likely start date. The first of which is this meeting that Fauci organizes, the Global Preparedness Board, where they're suddenly seemingly preparing for a global pathogen pandemic that everything they describe matches COVID pretty well. We step forward, a couple weeks to October 18th, and we have another event. You had mentioned 201, Event 201, which is used to describe these kind of catastrophic events. And there was a tabletop exercise that was held by Johns Hopkins and the Gates Foundation and the WEF on October 18th that was a preparedness for Event 201. And it was effectively a war game. And it's interesting because everything that they lay out almost mimics perfectly, once again, COVID. And there's one little glaring anomaly to that. They said that the Event 201 would come about through pig farms in Brazil, and that they would then spread to bats and then would spread to humans, which is pretty odd because Brazil's actually kind of a small player in the pig market. Who's the big player in the pig market? Well, it happens to be China. There's something like certainly more than 10 times the size of Brazil. 450 odd million head of pig a year versus like 25 million for Brazil. But I have a feeling that there was probably a reluctance to name the most obvious outlet being China. And so they specifically pointed a finger away from that. But it's also the participants. It was a very strange exercise, a very strange event, because they had some of the participants, you'd look at them and you think, what the heck are these people even doing there? Like their resume barely qualifies them. You're just surprised they're part of it. But then you have some other people whose resumes are astonishing, and that would include people like, once again, Chris Elias was there from the Gates Foundation. Gao Fu was there from the China CDC. Another person who was there was Avril Haines, the former deputy director of the CIA and Biden's current director of national intelligence. She was also at this event.
Sitting right next to Gao Fu, by the way.
What's that?
They sat next to each other for the event.
Exactly, sitting next to Gao Fu. Now, when you and I have talked about this and kind of pondered this event and looked at the participants and think, why this great disparity? It doesn't make sense. We've seen this again. Just because there's an event like this doesn't mean that that's actually the real event. You've got a different group of people brought together. I would love to know what side meetings actually transpired and who were part of this. Because again, having people like Elias, having people like Yao Fu, having people like Avril Haines, that's really something. That's quite a group of people that were brought together. And the timing at which they were brought together.
Right. I mean, we still have to draw the links from 2018 all the way through 2019, and that's still a bit patchy. But maybe one starting point here is, and again, talking about sort of private side meetings. You mentioned earlier there was this photo in Wuhan, and it's from 2018, and it's a group photo of November 2018. Of all these DEFUSE people, that means Daszak, Barak, Wang Linfa, Shi Zhengli, they're all there in the front row. But Chu is there as well, the lady we just talked about, the Chinese spy from the Winnipeg lab, and various other people. But one of the things that the Canadian report says is that this event they were there for, well, they don't say it was a cover, but they say that it was an event. That's what they're there for. And then they say there was a secret side event, which involved Chu and Shi Zhengli. And Chu was asked about it and, feigned ignorance, but there was such an event. Now, was Barak part of that, since he was there anyway, right? You don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people in that photo. But it's entirely feasible and possible that 4 or 5 or 6 of them would have sat together separately. And the reason why this is such a kind of enticing idea is because this was shortly after the Pentagon decided not to fund DEFUSE. And then all the DEFUSE people suddenly show up in China at the Wuhan lab. What are the chances they're not going to talk about the fact that the Pentagon didn't fund DEFUSE? Did they talk about something like that? Or alternatively, as we kind of mentioned earlier, maybe the Chinese just ran with it on their own. And now that we have this connection with Shi Zhengli being kind of the middle person on various fronts, she was the one who received these secret viruses, these lethal viruses out of Winnipeg. So she was the person who actually received them when they were sent over. She was the person who was the conduit between Chu and the PLA. And she was the person who ran a secret bat virus program in 2019, also at the Wuhan lab, of which Chu was a part. Not much is known about that, but that's also mentioned in these Canadian papers. So there was a secret bat virus program taking place there as well. Now, what I mentioned earlier is we need to still kind of draw a connection between all these events in 2018, and then how did that get us into 2019? And I think we're not there yet. There are still links missing and data and facts missing in terms of that. But I think we have all the ingredients for it to come together. In particular, to me, I mean, the one that still stands out from this past week is the PLA connection with Shi Zhengli. We knew that the Wuhan lab, had a PLA connection. We knew about Zhao Yuzhen's PLA connection. We knew a bunch of things, but that it's Shi Zhengli at the center of this, that to me is sort of the big thing here. And then we get back to the paranoia. Shi Zhengli knows, because she was 100% totally part of this diffuse thing. She knows everything about Pentagon, what Pentagon said. She would have had the Pentagon rejection letter, what they said. She knew everything. And I find it completely, unthinkable that she did not then go to her own PLA people and say, hey, by the way, this is what the Pentagon planned to do or might do or whatever. And then kind of things took off from there. But I think that's the point where I'm going to stop, because we just don't know enough yet. And then how that got us into 2019.
And just a couple other points on Shi Zhengli, for just to kind of remind people. We know she was actively working with Ralph Baric as far back as 2015, if possibly before that. We know that their lab got humanized mice from Ralph Baric's lab. We know that from the experiments that Daszak was doing. There was a lot of work that was done to kind of play down the humanized mice connection, but we did find it. We know that happened. So there's this kind of, I guess, I sort of feel like we were island hopping a little bit. We're going from stepping stone to stepping stone, and we're slowly adding more stepping stones into place. And there's one other meeting, though, that I would like to bring up that I think is worth getting more attention. And that's one that happened right after this Event 201. So again, we've got a lab leak sometime in the, late summer of 2019. We've got the John Hopkins study. We've got the Global Preparedness Board, of which Fauci's a part. We have the Event 201 in October 18th. And then on October 30th, we have a sudden conference call that's held. Well, I shouldn't say sudden. That's not entirely fair. There was a little bit of pre-planning on that. But there was a conference call that was initiated by NIH that then involved everybody from EcoHealth. And included in that was, I don't know the listing of people from the NIH, but we know, I would presume Fauci was on that. It was a high enough level call to attract everybody on the diffuse proposal. On that side, on EcoHealth, we know that Peter Daszak was there. We know that Wing Lang Fa, I always want to say is Lin Fa Wang. I always get thrown off by that, but I guess it's Wang Lin Fa. He was there, and we know that Ralph Baric was there. The godfather of gain of function was all on this call that was held on October 30th. Now,
whom Fauci pretends not to know, but
who Fauci, knows very well, but pretends that he doesn't know him. It's, I continue to think, I know I'm digressing a bit, but I continue just to think that Baric really holds the key to unraveling the whole knot. And that I also think there's a concurrent reason why he hasn't been brought forth.
Well, but, we have these people in three places now. The diffuse people, which means Baric, Daszak, Shi Zhengli, Wang Linfa, and a few others. But those are the main ones. Those are the operatives. They're the ones who brought the knowledge.
The directives,
in Daszak's case, more the grift. But anyway, we have them together in the summer of 2018, drafting this diffuse thing, or spring summer. And we have some of these through U.S. Right to Know. We have some of the drafts of that and so on. So they're together. They're constantly communicating about making a COVID-like virus in a lab and writing down how to do that and putting it in a blueprint. And that's what DEFUSE is. Then it's rejected, or the funding is rejected. And a few months later, this is, and by the way, the rejection letter does say that this is a highly interesting idea. And so it again, for a sort of the Shi Zhengli's or the PLA's mindset, that would have been very interesting. Like, this is very interesting, but we can't do it because it's too dangerous.
Which is what the letter said. The letter said this is a fascinating proposal, but you guys are trying to do gain of function research, which is outlawed. You can't do this.
Right, and so Shi Zhengli knew about the letter and what the Pentagon said, and so hence the PLA knew. And again, I think that triggers a lot of paranoia, that triggers a lot of interest, and so on. Anyway, so it's rejected. The funding is rejected, and then a few months later, 2 months later or so, all these people are together again in Wuhan at the Wuhan lab, and then, as you mentioned, about 10, 11 months later, they're together again at Fauci's office. And again, I think this is one of those where the stepping stones was a great analogy, because we don't have all of them yet. We're sort of, piecing them together. There's a couple of facts missing. There's a couple of links missing, and we'll get there in the end. But this thing is rejected. Then they're all in Wuhan. Of course, they're going to talk about it in some way or another, even if the Chinese went ahead on their own. And then they're in Fauci's office. What could the Fauci office meeting have been about? Talking about maybe we should do a vaccine, because what if the Chinese went ahead on their own? Maybe someone heard something from one of the people. I mean, we mentioned earlier that we're not just talking about like a cabal of like nefarious people. There's other people involved. There's like lab staff, lab hands, lab technicians, and so on. What if one of them told someone told Barrick, hey, by the way, Barrick, we've been doing this, or you just let slip, whatever. I don't know. I mean, there's a ton of possibilities there of something that could have triggered the October 2019 meeting at Fauci's office, which I think, given the composition of the people who were there, the fact that it's the DEFUSE people, the fact that it was Fauci's office, was probably to talk about the need for a vaccine, because something bad might have happened.
Yep. And again, I mean, for me, the fact that Barrick was there just adds that much more weight to things. Barrick's gone out of his way to try to keep a low profile on all of this. But yet, I think both you and I think that he's kind of one of the keys to everything here. Certainly, it feels to me like Barrick's being protected. I mean, he should have been the guy that should have been hauled forth. But, as this wasn't, that meeting at Fauci's office wasn't like, hey, give us an update on your most recent project and run us through a couple things. You don't have all of those heavyweights convening at the same time in that kind of place. It just, we're hypothesizing, but the stepping stones are getting closer and closer together. You're not having to make such a great leap at this point.
And one of the guys at the 2018 group photo, when they were all at the Wuhan lab, who hasn't been talked about so far, is from the Pentagon. Was from the Pentagon's university, the Uniformed Services University.
Yeah,
that's another one where I'm just like, what was he doing there? The Pentagon's? This is a university in Bethesda in Maryland. Like, do they have just interested, or how come he shows up with all these DEFUSE people just right after the Pentagon rejected the thing in Wuhan? Again, one of those where we need more stepping stones, but certainly very, very curious and very.
Well, here's the thing, Hans. This is reminiscent of you and I looking into Biden corruption. Is that every time we go down this path and we find new information, every single time, like as far as I can think of, without exception, the information that we obtain, the new information, dovetails neatly into everything else that we've been looking at. We're not stumbling across things that are like, oh wait, that invalidates this premise, or that invalidates this event. Everything actually fits in and amplifies everything. I've yet to see anything that's changed my thinking. It's only deepened my thinking and deepened my concerns.
Russiagate as well. Everything. Yeah. I mean, if I think back of how much information did I have, back in 2017? Not much, but every bit of the way. First, I found out about this guy called Peter Strzok. Then I found out about, we all did, about his text messages. Then I found out that about Hillary funding the dossier. And just think back over the past 6-7 years or so. It's the same thing. Everything is gone as in the same direction. There wasn't a single piece of information that ever came out that went in the opposite direction.
And one of the problems with this, you and I actually chatted about this a little bit offline, but there's a natural tendency when you uncover new information is to look at that information. It's one of the reasons I maintain timelines, is to look at that information as a single event. In other words, you find this new information and you dig into it. And you don't always have the requisite surrounding information to then place this event into. But the more information you get, all of a sudden you begin to draw the parallels and see the relevance of one event to the other. And again, everything that we've seen only advances the case, for a lab leak with some coordinated action. And I know we've said it, but that DEFUSE proposal, just to make sure that we're being very clear with people, it was absolutely 100% a blueprint for COVID. That thing described in immense detail the exact event that we ended up experiencing. It wasn't like a loose parallel. You literally could take that and put us where we are today.
Right, and we can specify. I mean, I said earlier, just to be super, super duper technically correct, a COVID-like virus, because and the reason why I said that is if you follow the instructions in the diffuse proposal, you might end up with COVID very easily. But you might also end up with a virus that is just like COVID, but not exactly like, because one of these some features are slightly different. Some of the, we earlier talked about these A's and G's and T's and C's, that there's somehow there's some variations there. Of course, that's possible. By the way, that was one of the reasons the natural origin crowd used to push back against diffuse. You can't call it a blueprint because it might turn out, you might by using it, you might come to, turn out to arrive at a different virus. Well, yeah, I mean, you could probably, if you did that 10 times, they, executed the blueprint, you'd end up with 10 different viruses, but they would all be COVID-like, and that's the point. And we can specify, use a synthetic backbone, a consensus backbone. That means the main part of the virus is not taken from nature. It's a consensus. That means you take different ones from nature and you find a sort of an average. And then insert a furin cleavage site, and not only insert a furin cleavage site, which, by the way, none of these viruses have ever featured in nature, but insert it at the S1, S2 junction, which is a very particular point on the within that genetic sequence. Those are the main benchmarks, but there's a bunch of others as well. And as you say, all of it is COVID, COVID, COVID. And when you mentioned, placing it in context, this is so important. When you have what was the media reporting about when the Chu story came out? I thought it was pretty okay. I mean, it wasn't being suppressed. Okay, it was like Daily Mail, the kind of usual suspects, but at least, the coverage was pretty decent, I thought. But the focus was Ebola, a synthetic Ebola was sent to the Wuhan lab by this lady Chu secretly as and that was the main thrust of the reporting. And that's true. And that's really, really terrible. But the fact that this lady Chu was then recruited to a secret bat program at the Wuhan lab in 2019, the fact that Chu was part of the 1,000 Talent program, the fact that some of the stuff was going to the PLA, and of course, in terms of what was not reported, was that Chu was there in 2018, right after the blueprint was completed and not funded. That just illustrates that once you put all those pieces of the puzzle together, it's about far more than just sending a synthetic or smuggling a synthetic Ebola virus out of a Canadian lab and sending it to Wuhan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point, because the way I look at it, yeah, it's Ebola gets a lot of headlines, right? But they're working at a BSL-4 lab, the top kind of flagship lab in Canada. It's by definition, they're going to have access to those types of viruses. And Chu's job was to get those and to get them sent back. So, okay, that's what she happened to get. It's almost de facto. Like if you had just been described that a Chinese researcher who was acting as a spy at the flagship BSL-4 lab in Canada, you probably could guess what she was going to get. That's not really the news. The news is she was being run by Shi Zhengli back at the Wuhan lab, and that's where everything was being transmitted, and that's where the diffuse proposal was supposed to be executed, and almost certainly was executed. And we have the same participants over and over again, leading up to the time frame that you and I believe was a likely leak of the virus, accidental or otherwise. And then we have the sequence of events, all of which culminate in Stéphane Bancel, the CEO of Moderna, quietly going to his head of production in late 2019 and telling him, hey, I know we only produced 100,000 vials of this stuff, doses of this stuff. I'm going to need 1 billion next year. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, he executes a formal agreement with Fauci for the actual production. It's
mobilization, right? Mobilization towards, full mobilization. And the thing with that is this was before anyone had heard of COVID, and in a way, even more importantly, do you remember the WHO put a message out that this does not transmit from human to human?
Yes.
That was after.
The
mobilization. So why would Fauci be mobilizing if this thing doesn't even transmit, right?
Why would Fauci be out there telling us that we need to worry more about the common flu far more than we need to worry about COVID after it was actually known? If he'd meanwhile executed an agreement for over 1 billion doses of a mRNA virus. Those
Right.
his actions don't gel either. I mean, that's a whole separate story into itself. Fauci was acting almost as if he wanted to allow this thing to propagate. He's giving he's giving not warnings, he's giving anti-warnings. He's telling people we don't need to worry about it. While privately, he appears to be worried about it a whole bunch. And the production and this push for the mRNA production, that's exactly what the Hopkins proposal and the Global Preparedness Board were calling for back in early September, was a big push on mRNA production and the ramp up in the use of it.
It's slowly starting to come together. I'll be honest here. I think it will take us a few more years to get a more complete picture. I mean, it took us 4 years just to get to where we are now. And with Russiagate, it took us 6-7 years to have pretty much a full picture. So it's going to take a while, but we'll get there.
Yeah, I don't know about you. There's many times where I've kind of felt like I've almost got the full picture, only to have more information come into it. But I'm a lot more comfortable stepping from one stepping stone to the next stepping stone.
It's the same here. I've always thought accidental, and I always thought hubris, those kinds of things. I considered PLA. I was like, maybe, but didn't really attach too much significance to that. But, that certainly changed, and that picture certainly changed. That doesn't mean it wasn't accidental. I still think it was accidental. I think number one, if they wanted to do this on purpose, they would have released it elsewhere. Now, some people do the reverse thing. They say, well, no, you would release it in Wuhan because it's so obvious, that sort of reverse thinking or whatever. But yes, maybe to put everyone, off your track, you release it in Wuhan, maybe. But what you do is you release it in the market. Jeff, imagine they had released it in the market.
We'd never know.
We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it right now.
We'd be under, yeah. Yep.
It would just be game over. Oh, it came out of the market. End of story.
There'd
Everything
no
else we just talked
disproving of
about,
anything.
fear and cleavage side, none of that would matter if they had just released it in the market. So that to me is kind of proof that this was not done on purpose. But all these other elements, why they were making it, why they were starting with the vaccine so early, why the Pentagon guy was over there in 2018, so many questions. And as I said, I think it will take us, we're not going to have the answers next week.
Yeah, we won't. But again, I think we can close by saying those stepping stones get closer and closer and closer.